To George, good evening.
Good evening. Hi, George. First of all, I want to say that I really wish you were Prime Minister, and I want to say that I'm Lebanese, and I wanted to tell you that there's always two sides to every story, and the problem here is that the media only reports one side of the story, and because nobody knows what happens in Lebanon, nobody knows what we lived through. They don't know the casualties. They always talk about the Israeli, the dead in Israel, but they don't talk about what's happening in Lebanon. They don't even, and the big problem is that Israel always gets away with everything they do. Nobody knows that Israel violates our airspace every little while. And they get away with that. If we did that, we would never get away with it because it's Lebanon. And I'm really worried about the war crimes because it's true that we have a big, how do you say that? We have proof of war crimes, but I really don't think they will be punished for what they did in my country.
Okay, Tatiana, thank you very much for that. If I were the Prime Minister of Britain, that probably means I'd have to take my holidays with Sir Cliff Richard and have John Prescott as my deputy. So I'd probably pass on that offer, kind though it was. The reality is a bit more complex, Tatiana. Much of the media coverage proceeded from the assumption that Israel is the injured party, Israel was the victim, and that the Hezbollah were the aggressors. I sense that has begun to change. Duncan just made the point, though I haven't seen the British papers, obviously, that even in the Sunday Times, Mr. Murdoch's whole media empire was totally pro-Israel during the war. He's now telling the story about little children picking up these little bomblets. I hate to call them bomblets because it makes them sound cute, and in fact they did look cute. It was almost irresistible, illogical though it was. One wanted to pick it up, and if you were a child who didn't know what it was, of course you would pick it up. And it seems the Sunday Times have reported today about 3 children in South Lebanon that did just that and suffered horrific injuries. Now, it is an act of illegality. It is a war crime. No argument about it. It is a war crime to use cluster bombs in civilian areas. And we now have overwhelming evidence. Tatiana, I saw myself literally hundreds, I couldn't count them, hundreds of these cluster bomblets all over the place in the civilian areas of South Lebanon today. Now, the United Nations has seen them. Indeed, the United Nations is picking them up at great risk to the personnel involved. But who's going to take Israel to court? This is the question. This is the big question. This is prima facie a clear war crime. Who is going to hold Israel accountable? On past form, you're right to be skeptical because Israel has been allowed to break laws, international laws, for decade after decade after decade, and has not been punished, but been rewarded as a result.
Yeah, exactly. Can I add something too?
Tatiana, very quickly, please.
Yeah, quickly. There was someone who was talking about the survival of Israel, but Lebanon also wants to live and is trying to survive a lot of problems that we have. And we did get through some of these problems, and now we have more problems because half the country is destroyed.
That's right.
So it's also a matter of survival for us.
Okay, Habib, thank you very much.
Many thanks for your call. George, lots of texts and emails coming in here. I'm just filleting them out. We've got one here from Nadia. She says, my family and I are listening in both Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, and we're listening to the show. It is nice to hear that not all British citizens think of us Arabs and Muslims as subhuman villains out to make everyone miserable just for the fun of it. Some can actually see...
Can I comment on that, Duncan?
Well, let me finish
before you read on.
Okay.
Duncan, Tony Blair was told by Hezbollah and many other Lebanese forces that he's not welcome in Lebanon. He better forget the idea of coming here as any kind of peace envoy. And I have to go around behind Tony Blair throughout the Arab world and the Muslim world like the man that sweeps up after the Lord Mayor's show, sweeping up the mess that Tony Blair leaves for us all over the Muslim world. Nadia, I am telling people in the Arab and Muslim world, and I'm glad that you're listening so far apart as Morocco and the Emirates, that British people should not be blamed, and still less should they be harmed because of the crimes of Tony Blair. He does not speak for the majority of the British people on this subject.
She goes on to say, some can actually see that we are human beings with emotions and that we have just as much right to defend ourselves as anyone else does. I believe most of those who cannot see this yet are simply misinformed. That's Nadia and her family listening in both Morocco and the United Arab Emirates. If you'd like to email us, talksport.net is the website. Send us an email. Chris in Derby has texted in, George, do you know anything about the huge oil slick off the Lebanese coast caused by the Israeli bombing of the oil depot? It seems to have been conveniently missed by the media.
Well, actually, Duncan, I'm looking at it. It was a deliberate act. They bombed the protective wall so that the oil could get out, and then they bombed the huge tanks so that the oil would burst into the Mediterranean Sea. And it has now caused tremendous pollution right down this coast. The current was going north, so it reached as far as a place called Jubail, Jubail, an ancient Roman settlement, one of the jewels of the Orient, one of the loveliest little places on God's earth, has been completely ruined by an oil slick deliberately created by Israeli bombing, which was pinpoint in its accuracy. I saw it today. They punched a hole in the wall, then they punched the hole in the tanks, so that the oil could get out of the tanks and into the Mediterranean Sea. And it's polluted beaches as far away as Cyprus.
If you'd like to text us this evening between now and 10 o'clock, it's 81089. It'll cost you 50 pence plus your normal network rate. Any questions to George, just like Chris in Derby, 81089, www.talksport.net. Go there, send us an email, or call us 08704 20 20 20. George Galloway in South Lebanon. I'm Duncan Barks in the United Kingdom. And it is Talksport, 1089, 10:53 a.m. across the UK on digital radio as well. And we're broadcasting live this evening across Edinburgh, Fife and the Lothians on Talk 107. Let's go to Halim in Leeds. Halim, you're through to George. Good evening.
Hi, good evening, George. Just a quick question. I saw on the BBC website yesterday that they found some markings on the cluster bombs which confirmed that they were made in America, and when it was put to the Americans that this was probably an illegal use of the firearms supplied to Israel, and the Americans' response was that they will look into this illegal use of these arms by Israel. Do you think that the Americans will take some action against Israel?
I really don't, Halim. They do know that these weapons were used by Israel in the way that they were. They did not stop them. And by the way, these weapons were transshipped to Israel through British airports. So we have a hand in the commission and in the execution of a war crime. Mr. Blair knew, although Margaret Beckett, the Foreign Secretary, did not know, or said she didn't, although you might argue that she ought to have. She is, of course, the Foreign Secretary of a once great country. Mr. Blair knew that these weapons were being shipped through British airports, including Prestwick Airport in Scotland and other military airports in England, and they were going to Israel. Israel was then using these weapons illegally, committing war crimes. So when we come to tally up the list for accountability on this, Mr. Blair's government is yet again culpable. But if you ask me, Halim, will either Bush or Blair or any other British or American personnel end up in court over this? I doubt it, and on the basis of Israel's past record, I don't expect to see any of them in the dock either.
Halim, thanks very much for your call. Let's go to Steve in